topic Irene has already told you, and it's there on the screen. My inspiration, the inspiration of the ashram, and the inspiration of many of us here comes from the Mother and Sri Aurobindo, these two spiritual masters who were in fact spiritual collaborators. And it might interest you to know that the Mother originally came from France, and she was born in Paris, and she used to take long walks in Luxembourg Park in Paris. Why should we talk about the mind-body relationship at all? Isn't it common sense? The time when we get the attacks of common cold the most are when we are under stress. The time when children get fever is when their exam is coming. That's why we have this term exam fever. So isn't this common sense? But then what is common sense sometimes ceases to be common sense with experts. And that is what happened to people in the field of medicine over the last 100 years or so. And how that happened was, doctors also believed in mind-body relationship till the beginning of the 20th century. How that change came about was the result of, in fact, a few spectacular developments in modern medicine. And the most important of these were that the infectious diseases were conquered with the help of vaccines and antibiotics, and nutritional deficiencies were also overcome. We could pack vitamins in a pill and give them, and some important endocrine deficiencies like diabetes were also conquered because you could give the replacement in the form of insulin and the person was cured. So, and these were sort of new discoveries or new ways of treating which did not require the mind-body relationship. And on the other hand, their impact was spectacular because they wiped out some of the common killers of mankind, and the result was that the lifespan increased. If you read any of the classical novels by people like Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, you find that the characters start dying at the age of 30 and hardly anybody lives beyond 50, because that was the usual lifespan in the 17th and 18th century or even till the 19th century. But the new ways of treatment, these advances that we had in modern medicine in the early part of the 20th century increased the life expectancy, especially in the Western world, from about 30 or 40 to more than 70 years. And this conquest did not depend upon the mind-body relationship, because no matter what a person is thinking, if you give the person insulin, the blood sugar will come down. Or if a person has typhoid, you don't require the participation of the patient's mind for the patient to recover in less than a week. A fever that went on for more than a month now could come down in less than a week by just giving the right antibiotic. And it didn't matter what the patient was thinking. So the mind-body relationship didn't seem to matter anymore. It got eclipsed, and modern medical people forgot about it. But then after the 1950s came a humbling experience. Man did not become immortal, and people started dying of a new set of diseases like heart disease, complications of diabetes, stroke, and cancer. And these diseases were not just different diseases, they were a different kind of diseases. In these diseases, the mind-body relationship did matter, and these diseases did not lend themselves to simplistic solutions like, say, the presence of a germ and kill it, or the deficiency of a nutrient and replace it. They did not lend themselves to this sort of simplistic solutions, and that is what once again made modern medicine realize the value of the mind-body relationship. Let me tell you a story. This is about an experimental study which was done on rabbits, and the study was on atherosclerosis, the type of lesion that people have in arteries which gives rise to heart disease. And rabbit is a good model for it, because by giving a high-fat, high-cholesterol diet to rabbits, one can produce the disease within 4 weeks. So these rabbits were divided, as is done in experiments, into two groups. One group was given the usual rabbit diet, grass and all that, carrots, and the other group was given a high fat, high cholesterol diet. Now, as expected, when the results were analyzed, the group which got the usual rabbit diet did not get the disease, but the rabbits which got a high fat, high cholesterol diet, these rabbits also sorted themselves out into two groups. One group got the disease and one didn't. Of course, the experimental results are not so much in black and white, but I'm trying to simplify it. But that was the sort of trend that one group of rabbits getting the high fat and high cholesterol diet got the disease and another group did not. Now, how come that happened? So they went into the detail. And they found that this happened to do something with the position of the cage. These rabbits were kept in the animal house, and in the animal house there were cages which were kept on racks in a and the rack had shelves, and those which were high up on the top shelves, these were the ones who got the disease. Those which were in the bottom shelves did not get the disease. Now, what could the position of the cage have to do with getting or not getting the disease? So they investigated further. And they found that the technician who came to feed the rabbits, she was not very tall. When she went to the cages at the lower level, she took the rabbit out, held it in her lap, cuddled it, fondled it, and then kept it back in the cage lovingly and then gave it food. Whereas when it came to the top cages, she could hardly reach there. She just went up, opened the cage, threw the food and shut the cage. So the rabbits which got a daily dose of love and affection, in addition to the high fat, high cholesterol diet, could overcome the defects of this unhealthy diet, overcome the effects of this unhealthy diet. So psychological factors can be that important. And this study, of course, brings it out in a very striking manner. But there is a lot of evidence now available for the mind-body relationship, and it comes primarily from three streams. Experimental evidence. One set of experiments are the type that this rabbit story was about. Then there is epidemiological evidence and clinical evidence, and we'll go over these three sources of evidence one by one. This person, Norman Cousins, was not a doctor, but a very well-read person, a scholar, a thinker, and a very nice man, and but not a doctor or a medical scientist. He came down with ankylosing spondylitis in the 1960s. Ankylosing spondylitis is a painful autoimmune disease from which hardly 1 in 500 recover. So when he came down with this disease, being an educated man, he started studying about his disease and discovered that the doctors really don't have much to offer. So he took charge himself of his disease, and somehow through some sort of things which he read and intuitively, he felt that psychological stress which he had gone through a little before coming down with the disease had something to do with it. So he asked a simple question which doctors had forgotten to ask. If mental stress could give me the disease, will not happiness be able to help me recover from it? Looks like a very simple question, but because doctors had forgotten about the mind-body relationship, they had forgotten about it. So in a way, ignorance helps. He was not a doctor, and that's why he could ask that question. And so he took charge of his disease himself and stopped taking painkillers. And he also figured out that the painkillers that he had already taken had depleted his body of vitamin C. So he started taking large amounts of vitamin C and started watching comedies so that he could laugh. And literally he came through, he cured himself with a combination of laughter and vitamin C. But then he didn't stop with his cure. He went into this further, discovered more stories, developed a whole theory around it, and then came up a little later with a book called Anatomy of an Illness. And this book became a bestseller. It was taken note of also by doctors and medical scientists. And to cut a long story short, this man went on to stimulate a lot of research, which then gave rise to an entirely new field of science called psychoneuroimmunology. Psycho is the mind. The mind, through the neuro, that is the nervous system, can affect the immune system of the body. The immune system is the system that protects us from disease. So if a person is happy, cheerful and relaxed, his defense mechanisms improve, his immune system improves, he develops a good ability to resist disease. And that is what psychoneuroimmunology was about. And he went on to stimulate so much research, medical research in this area, that very soon there was a discipline, psychoneuroimmunology, and he is today considered the father of psychoneuroimmunology. So that is the mind-body, one source of evidence for the mind-body relationship. These experiments, particularly in psychoneuroimmunology, which have now established that it works both ways. If a person is cheerful, happy and relaxed, his immune system improves, and if the person is under chronic stress, long-term stress, then the immune system becomes weak. Another set of evidence comes from epidemiological studies, that is studies on large populations. And this person, Dane Ornish, is a cardiologist. He didn't do these studies, but in his book Love and Survival, he has put together a large number of such studies which have been done in a few universities. These studies were done on university students when they were in their 20s. They were given psychological questionnaires, and then they were followed up for another 30 years. 30 years later, these students were again given psychological questionnaires. Very difficult studies, very laborious studies. To follow the same person 30 years later is difficult, but such studies have been done, and there is enough data from these studies to show that students who were happy, who were psychologically well adjusted, who had good relationships with their family and the other people around them. In other words, I mean, those who were on the whole happy and cheerful and well adjusted to their environment, these people had around 50% chance of getting one of the midlife diseases like high blood pressure, heart disease or cancer or diabetes when they were above 50. Above 50% chance of having one of these diseases, even if they were happy. How about the other group, which were not well adjusted and unhappy? These people, this group of students, now of course they were grown up men and women, above 50, this group had a nearly 100% chance of having one of these midlife diseases. So the risk gets cut down to half just by psychological factors. So all the other factors like diet, exercise, smoking, drinking, etc., assuming that they were evenly distributed in both these groups, would have contributed to the disease in those who were happy. And of course heredity is also important. There's a family history that increases the tendency to get such a disease. But then those who were cheerful and happy, at least half of them could protect themselves from getting a disease till the age of 50. So psychological factors are that important, as these studies have shown. So that's fine, but then what about the application of this? Because this just shows that if people are unhappy, they fall sick. Norman Cousins did show that if you are happy, then you can recover. But does that work on diseases like heart disease or diabetes or cancer? Now, that is where once again we have Dr. Dane Ornish coming in. He's a cardiologist, and being a cardiologist trained in modern medicine, how did he get into this? Again, to cut a long story short, he has talked about it in his books, his own personal history, but he went through an existential crisis before he joined medicine. And that brought him in contact with an Indian Swami, Swami Sachidanand in the US. And through him he discovered how you can be happy irrespective of your external circumstances. And that's how he overcame that existential crisis and eventually went on to become a doctor. But then while he was in medical school, he was struck by the fact that although by then medical science knew that heart disease is a multifactorial disease, many things contribute to it, including an unhealthy diet, lack of physical activity, mental stress, smoking and so on. All these things contribute to heart disease. All that was known even in the 1970s when he was a medical student. But then he found that the patients in the hospital were being treated, patients of heart disease, but being treated in the hospital exclusively with drugs and surgery. On top of that, he found that in the same hospitals which were treating patients with heart disease were selling hamburgers and cigarettes in their lobbies. That was the paradox. And then he again asked a simple question: if all these things are contributing to the disease, will not stopping these things help? And then he thought, instead of stopping them and making life miserable for the persons, if a person is accustomed to a non-vegetarian diet, omelets and cutlets and fried foods and so on, and he enjoys smoking, to tell him to stop all these things overnight will be a lot of stress, and stress is also contributing to the disease. So why not try the yogic way? Because from Swami Satchidanand he had learned quite a bit about yoga by then, and knew that in yoga you can be happy independent of external circumstances. You are not dependent upon smoking or drinking to keep your stress away. There are better ways of keeping stress away, and why not try that? And he started doing these studies while he was still a medical student. He took a year off, did a study. The study was not well accepted because it didn't fit into the medical science at that time, the way it was looked upon. But he went on doing more studies, better studies. He continued to do the studies after he became a doctor and a cardiologist. And then came his landmark study, which was published in the Lancet in 1990. And in this study, he showed that people who have been treated with a lifestyle modification based on yoga, they not only felt better, but they actually got better as demonstrated by angiography. So the degree of blockage of the coronary arteries in the patients who got this yogic intervention reduced at the end of 1 year. So 1 year of this type of intervention reduced the degree of narrowing of the coronary arteries. In contrast, the control group which did not get the yogic intervention, they continued to take the usual treatment, drug treatment for heart disease. These were not patients who had such severity as to need surgery. So they continued taking the usual medical treatment, and they pulled on. Their angina or pain in the chest was under control, but when it came to the angiographic studies, their block increased. The effect was not dramatic, but it was consistent. Say if we started with 50% block in both these groups, at the end of 1 year, the group which got the yogic intervention had say 47% block. Now, their block didn't disappear, but arteries were now less blocked. Whereas in the other group, if they started with 50% block at the end of 1 year, the blockage now was 53%. So it was very consistent. The effect was small, but it was significant, and this was a major advance because till then, in medical science, the belief was that chronic degenerative disease like heart disease either stay the same or they get worse. They cannot get better. He showed that they can get better, which means we have self-healing mechanisms even for these chronic degenerative diseases in the body. And then he went on to write his classic Reversal of Heart Disease, Dr. Dean Ornish's program for reversing heart disease. So reversal doesn't mean that the person's arteries become completely clean like that of a newborn baby. That doesn't happen, but at least the disease starts reversing, in contrast with the disease continuing to progress in those who did not get the yogic intervention. Then this is another doctor, Dr. Bernie Siegel. He's a cancer surgeon. Again, an American cancer surgeon. And while treating his cancer patients, he observed that a few exceptional patients got completely cured. Because the general understanding is that most people with cancer, irrespective of what you do, die. And that's what happened in his patients also. But then he found a few people overcame the disease completely. They seemed to get cured. They went on living much beyond any doctor's expectations. And then he found that these patients did not have a different type of disease. They did not have a mild disease. The diagnosis was not wrong. These were different type of people. And what was the difference? The difference was basically in the minds of these people. And these people had primarily three characteristics. The first was that they did not believe they are doctors. If the doctor told them that those who have the cancer of the type and the stage that you have generally live for less than 1 year, These people said, the doctor is not God, I'll prove him wrong, I'll live longer than 1 year. So these patients had a will to live. They didn't believe the doctor fully, they said, I'll prove the doctor wrong. This was one thing. The second thing was that they did not focus their attention entirely on the disease. They started thinking of all those things that they wanted to do, that they loved to do, but they had been postponing so far. So they thought that now that I have a notice, I'll not live very long, why not do those things? So started doing those things and started enjoying them. So their attention was not focused on the disease, their attention was focused on living a fuller life. The third characteristic that they had was that not only they did not focus their attention on the disease, they did not even focus their attention on themselves. They started looking beyond themselves. They became more helpful, they became more caring, they started sharing more. In short, they started loving more. They started loving those around them even more. They thought, I have only a short life to live, why not live a life full of love? And they started giving, caring and sharing more. Now, people who had these three characteristics seem to live longer. And there are plausible explanations why it happened, because cancer protects us. The immune system protects us not only from infections, the immune system protects us also from cancers. So these people, since they were happy and cheerful, they had stronger immune systems, and that is how they could overcome their cancer. So then he asked again a very important question. He asked, if to some people this type of an attitude comes normally and naturally, can it be induced? Because it's generally believed that people don't change. Very difficult to change anybody's attitude. But then, if a person has a disease like cancer, at least the person is a little more receptive, a little more amenable to change. So he tried. And he found that yes, to some extent people do change. In that state they can be changed. And he showed that if we introduce that type of psychological intervention, which changes people for the better, makes them better people and more loving, then he found that these people not only live a more meaningful life, the remainder of the life itself becomes longer. And then he also went on to write a few paperbacks. He has written several by now, and one of the best known is Love, Medicine and Miracles. So we have evidence from at least these three sources which has placed the mind-body relationship on a scientific footing, and happily it works both ways. Not only being under stress increases the possibility of disease, being happy and cheerful also helps in overcoming it. In other words, for the body to be healthy, the mind should be at peace. Or as the mother has said, establish a greater peace and quietness in your body that will give you the strength to resist attacks of illness. Now, how can we apply this? Of course, we can apply it the way Dean Ornish, Bernie Siegel and many more have applied it, but then are there some difficulties? One of the difficulties involved is that even now, somehow modern science has taught doctors as well as patients to believe that the body is like a machine. So when they go to a doctor, they have the attitude of going to an automobile mechanic. Doctor, I have something wrong with my body, find out what is wrong and fix the problem. Which means that they hand over the entire responsibility to the doctor, expect him to work like an automobile mechanic and fix the fault, because the body is also a machine. In other words, patients are not always very willing to do the work, because when it comes to being happier and more relaxed, or say making a change in the diet, or becoming physically more active, or giving up smoking, these are things which require the patient to do some work. And they're not always willing to do it. It is much easier to swallow a few pills than to make all these drastic changes in lifestyle. So this is one problem which comes in practice. The second problem is that the mind is very difficult to control. Even if the patient is willing to do the work, it is not easy. The mind is difficult to control because mind has two aspects, feeling and thinking. The emotional part of the being and the intellect. And both these are difficult to control because emotions, of course, are proverbially volatile. The intellect also doesn't help much because it is indecisive. It can justify just about everything. Let's take one example. Suppose a person goes to a party and he finds a lavish spread of food. It's very tempting to eat all of it, as much of it as possible. But then he remembers the doctor has told me to be careful, not to overeat, not to eat too much of fried food and so on and so forth. But then he says, but once in a while it will not matter. The hostess has worked so hard, she'll feel bad if I don't do justice to the food. Let me eat well today, I'll compensate for it tomorrow. So the intellect can justify just about everything. So the intellect is indecisive. And therefore, the person cannot be at peace if he depends upon working on his mind, exclusively on working on the mind to be more at peace. So the patients don't generally want to do the work. When they want to do the work, it is difficult. Which means that for the mind to be at peace, it needs an anchor. It needs an anchor which itself is not volatile, which is not indecisive, which speaks in a clear voice, a definitive voice, and which is itself always at peace, doesn't have any desires, doesn't get tempted, doesn't get angry, that sort of an anchor. Do we have that sort of an anchor within us? Fortunately we do. That anchor is our soul. And that is why spirituality enters this, and Dean Ornish, Bernie Siegel, and all the other pioneers in mind-body medicine have been deeply spiritual people. Now, how does one anchor the mind to the soul? What does it really mean? Firstly, we have to acknowledge that we are more than the body and the mind. If we say that we are basically the body and the mind, then the question of the soul doesn't arise. So it recognizes that we are more than the body and the mind, and that additional entity, which in fact is our fundamental reality, our immortal reality, is the soul. Now once we have this knowledge, we identify ourselves not just with the body and the mind, we identify ourselves with the body, mind and soul. Now this wider identification gives us a wider vision and wider goals in life, because then our goal in life is not just to take care of the mind and the intellect, mind and the emotions and the intellect, because that would mean that we have a physically comfortable life, we have good food, sex, good furniture, a good car, and some intellectual satisfaction, good education, and so on and so forth. Now that would take care of the needs of the body and the mind. But how about the soul? That will not get satisfied by this, and it is because we neglect the soul that getting all these things still leaves us unhappy. So this wider identification, that is acknowledging the existence of the soul, will give us a wider vision, a new way of looking at life, and higher goals in life. And this new vision will then start guiding our life. And again, to make it short and simple, this new life will be guided primarily by love. This love would translate into giving what we have to those who need it, and this giving would translate into the joy of giving, and this is what will give us peace. So in short, anchoring the mind to the soul means bringing more love into life. That's what Bernie Siegel also says. He has said so many things based on love. It's just one of them, one quote. Love releases incredible energy that promotes the biochemistry of healing. That is what modern science has done. Placed the mind-body relationship on a scientific footing. It affects the immune system, it affects our blood chemistry, which means that the effects of the mind, which is by itself subjective and touchy-feely, can be shown on measurable objective parameters like biochemistry or immunocompetence. And here is Dean Ornish. Says not diet, not drugs, not exercise, not smoking, not surgery, not even genetics. No other factor has a more powerful effect on health and premature death and disease than love and intimacy. And finally, Sri Aurobindo, to feel love and oneness is to live. Life itself becomes meaningful only when we feel love, and love will lead to oneness, or recognition of oneness will inspire love.